In a previous video, I broke down some of the issues Pokemon Scarlet and Violet has with landscape design, and how this contributes to poor perceptions and reviews. I mentioned the challenge of why Pokemon or anyone else should care about this, given it's one of the biggest selling games anyway, and why does any of this matter, right? What I found in researching this is Pokemon games have a massive pre-order and launch sales period, and then a dramatic fall-off in sales. Sword and Shield sold around 24 million copies in its first 3 years. 65% of those sales were in its launch quarter. So far, Scarlet and Violet has sold 26.8 million copies in its first 2.5 years, which is a lot more than Sword and Shield, but 77% of those sales were in its first quarter. Well, this means that people aren't buying these games through word of mouth. Their sales are heavily dependent on marketing and existing fans. If we have a closer look at the sales excluding that first quarter, it shows that this tail in sales is even worse for Scarlet and Violet compared to Sword and Shield. So this is a nice fact, but how does this compare with other big selling Switch games? To make comparisons easier, I've worked out the quarterly sales of some of the biggest selling Switch games as a percentage of their first launch quarter sales. You can see the two Pokemon games towards the bottom of the graph, and a very different pattern for Animal Crossing New Horizons and Kirby Forgotten Lands. Now, Kirby is obviously a much smaller selling game, but I've added it into this graph to show that Animal Crossing isn't a unicorn. It's an example of a game which is heavily driven by word of mouth and post-launch hype. At a much smaller scale, Kirby did the same thing as Animal Crossing, receiving really good reviews, a lot of word of mouth, and built up sales over time. If we take Animal Crossing and Kirby off the graph, it's easier to directly compare the Pokemon games against the popular Mario franchise games also on the Switch. You can see the Mario games are maintaining around about 10% of their launch sales in 3 years after they were released, even hitting 15% in their fourth Christmas after they were launched. Now, in comparison, Scarlet and Violet is barely hitting 5% of launch quarter sales in its second Christmas after launch. We can play some hypothetical games to work out how many sales Pokemon is potentially leaving on the table by having such a dramatic decline after launch. Now, if Scarlet and Violet had just the same sales tail as Sword and Shield, which remember is not very impressive itself, then by now it would have sold 31.15 million copies, which would make it the biggest selling Pokemon game of all time. If Pokemon games had the same sort of post-launch reception as Mario games, they would have sold an extraordinary volume. The same sales tail as Super Smash Bros. Would have given it 40.7 million sales, and for Super Mario Party it would be 57.5 million. It's unrealistic to imagine a Pokemon game could ever have a quiet launch and then build up hype and sales over time, but just for comparison, if it did have the same sales profile as Animal Crossing, it would have sold 69 million copies. But even with the lowest comparisons here, it's pretty clear that Pokemon is leaving at least $200 to $300 million of sales on the table, perhaps as much as $750 million. Now, because I'm thorough with my research, almost to the point of it being a liability, I've looked into how the sales compare with reviews. Well, this chart shows the total sales of all of the mainline Pokemon games. The ones that are shaded slightly lighter are the ones that came out earlier in a console's lifetime, so they would have had a smaller potential audience. Obviously, different consoles sell different volumes, so we can display by the total number of consoles sold, effectively displaying the proportion of owners of the console that bought the particular Pokemon game. For comparison, we can also add in some other high-selling Switch game. And what this shows is that the Pokemon games on the Switch are not making the best use of their potential audience. The Metacritic review score is a decent measure of the overall reception for a game. It's not perfect, but it's useful for our purposes here. So we can compare the sales of different Pokemon games against their various Metacritic review scores. This shows broadly the perception of Pokemon games is declining with each new generation. But importantly, it shows that the reviews really started to decline as Pokemon moved onto the Switch and into 3D open world environments. To try and see if there is a relationship between the Metacritic review score and the total number of sales for these big franchise games, I plotted up the Metacritic review score against sales for the Pokemon games on the 3DS and the Switch, as well as some other big selling Switch games where I was able to find the data. Our trend line fitted through this data predicts 81% of the variation. Now, what this means in simple terms is that 81% of the difference between the sales of these games is down to their review score. Now, 81% is an extraordinarily high number for this type of relationship, and this shows there's a really strong relationship between reviews and sales for Nintendo games. Now, translating this into simple numbers, this means that for every extra 5% in review score for these big franchise games, it means an extra 2 million units sold. Now, this means in the case of Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, if it had got a review score of 80% instead of the 72% it did get, so the same review as Sword and Shield, it would have sold an extra 3.3 million more copies. Now that's 30 million sales in total, which is pretty close to the 31 million I predicted if it had followed Sword and Shield's sales tail. This shows both these ways of analysing the sales results are coming to broadly the same conclusion. Now if Scarlet and Violet could have got up to say 85% review scores, that would be an extra 5.3 million more copies sold. But again, people are going to say Pokemon makes a load of money, why should they care? Well, last year, the games division of the Pokemon Company made $1.2 billion in gross revenue. And that's about 10% of their total company revenue. About $1 billion of that is mobile gaming. And from its sales figures, we can estimate that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet is accounting for about $120 million in gross revenue a year. And the improvements in the game world, which I talked about in the last video, would contribute to better review scores and a better reception post-launch. And so the additional sales would be in this post-launch period. So increasing that review score to 80 or even 85% would mean an annual revenue increase of 70 to $100 million. So we're talking about something just short of doubling the post-launch annual revenue of a mainline series game, increasing the games division annual revenue by 8% and increasing the total company revenue by 1%. Or to put it another way, the potential increase in revenue is the same as the annual gross revenue of Pokemon EX Masters, Pokemon Unite, Pokemon Cafe Remix and Pokemon Quest combined. And I don't think many people are questioning why the Pokemon Company bothers to make these smaller mobile games when they're selling loads of trading cards and plushies and making loads of money on other things. So in summary, the issues leading to the poor reception of mainline Pokemon games, including landscape optimization, are leading to the Pokemon Company missing out on around about $200 to $500 million worth of sales per game. I don't believe any company is large enough or diversified enough that they can afford to pass up that kind of increase in revenue, particularly when the cost to engage the appropriate talent and expertise to address these issues will be a fraction of that increase in revenue. If you found this interesting, check out some of my other videos and don't forget to mash all the various buttons to show your appreciation and to keep up to date when I release new analysis.